Pada 1, Sutra 2, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga union is consciousness with its movement still. This sutra can also be translated, stilling the movements of the mind leads to union, and union leads to the stilling of the movements of the mind. Yoga or union is both the path and the goal. How to still the mind is described in Sutra 1.12. When the surface of the lake is still, it reflects the moon above it perfectly. When the water is troubled, the one moon appears as many. Consciousness in the human identifies with what it sees. If the mind is filled with the incessant hammering of innumerable thought streams, it is impossible for the mind to experience its peaceful nature. Yet let the chattering of internal noise still for even a moment, and the individual mind naturally slips into what the psychologist Abraham Maslow described as the peak experience. This is a radically different style of functioning of the nervous system. It is characterized by internal silence, clarity, joy, and perfect fluidity of effective, life-supporting action. If we carefully analyze the preconditions of the peak experience, we find that it naturally occurs in moments of intense absorption, the jogger's high, the zone of many athletes, the mystical union experienced by painters, composers, artists at the moment when, through intense enjoyment or focus, all the subsidiary, random, chaotic movements of the mind still and consciousness experiences itself, one without a second. Transformation of consciousness is natural. What is unnatural is to continue with the mind hammering out its 50,000 thoughts a day, most of them the same as yesterday's, many of them self-contradictory. The body attempts to respond to these constant thought streams. The neuropeptides the brain cells release to communicate with each other are read by every cell of the body and every organ throughout every system. What happens when so much activity runs ceaselessly through the mind, through the machine of the body? What would happen to any machine that never shuts down periodically for maintenance? If you were always running your car without ever changing the oil, what would happen to it? Yet this is what we do to our bodies. Small wonder they start falling apart and rarely reach the century mark. The mind is never still in the waking state. When the constant chattering of the internal dialogue is stilled, union with the higher self is natural, for this is the normal state of the nervous system. It is the constant activity which is abnormal. Simply because the typical human only rarely experiences inner peace does not mean that the frenetic chaos of the waking state mind is meant to endure forever. When the surface of the mind is cluttered with noise, it is difficult or impossible to experience union. With the surface of the pond broken into countless wavelets, it is impossible to tell exactly what is being reflected. So the requirement for union is simple: allow the mind to become still. How is this to be accomplished? Not through force or effort, which only raises the physiological rate and tires the mind. Force or effort is often included in the typical translation of the sutra. It is commonly said that union is the result of repressing or restraining the movements of the mind. This thinking betrays an unfamiliarity with the natural conditions of the mind. The natural condition of the mind is silence. If you drop a handful of pebbles into a still pool, the surface erupts in chaos. If you continually barrage consciousness with the movements of thought, it will be impossible to see what consciousness really is. But let movement still, even for an instant, and consciousness recognizes its union with its higher self, the omnipresent spark of eternity that exists inside everyone, everywhere, always. It must be emphasized that this sutra does not tell how to still the movements of consciousness, nor does it suggest that strenuous effort is required. It is precisely the misinterpretation of sutras such as this one, that has led to the demise of the effectiveness of the science of yoga. If we wish the mind to still, introduction of strain or effort will not serve us. On the contrary, by trying to force the mind to calmness, we will raise the physiological rate and tire the mind. Have you ever studied hard for a test? Is it tiring? Work? Stimulants such as caffeine will succeed for only so long. Eventually the mind will be exhausted and impose stillness, but it will be the stillness of sleep, not the stillness of expanded consciousness. What is required to still the mind is an object of attention that charms the mind, thereby allowing it to settle down to more and more universal and silent levels of functioning. This object could take any number of possible forms, but the one universal requirement of the practice of ascension must be that it is increasingly effortless. It is desirable to still the mind. So if it is desirable to still the mind, it is necessary to begin from where the mind is, active in the midst of motion. Systematically quieting down the mind is the purpose of the science of yoga. It is not only natural, it is extremely easy. There are only 3 requirements. There must be 1, a functioning nervous system capable of thought. There must be also 2, a suitable vehicle for the mind to follow in this process of stilling, a vehicle which naturally and effortlessly pulls the mind inward to ever deeper levels of silence, until even the faintest level of activity is ascended and the conscious mind experiences its true form, the higher self. And there also needs to be 3, competent guidance to ensure the necessary feedback that verifies the correctness of the practice. Thus, it is extremely difficult for tapes or books to teach techniques validly, for the 3rd requirement is missing. Even if the prospective student is proceeding completely correctly, how would he or she ever know without verification from a qualified instructor? What happens if the movements of thought do still?